Well, let's get rolling tonight. Kind of got a special presentation going tonight. We're actually going to be taking a look at general use of 3D uh, modeling inside VCarve. But before we get rolling, I've got a couple things I want to cover. First off, I got a request from a couple of people to kind of a little update of the Christmas ornaments. So I've got some pictures here to show you. Let me bring up my screen here. There we go. So I had a request from a couple of people wanting to see how the Christmas ornaments turned out. So what you see on the screen there, the top three there, of course, that's straight off the ones that we worked with. And you can see I did some in acrylic, and then I added some, some paint to some of them. Some left some natural. But yeah, they worked out nice. I made a couple dozen, gave them away. The one on the right side over there, that's actually the logo from our church, and the pastor's wife is a graphic artist. So I took her design and converted that to a acrylic carving, and it turned out quite nice. And then Steve, I think Steve's online tonight. He sent me these pictures, these two at the bottom here. He actually had a 3D model setup question, which is able to help him with. But I was pretty intrigued. That design that you see there, very lightweight. It looks like it's 1/8 material. He did a little 3D carving on one side and the 2D carving on the other, and actually made use of the tabs to actually kind of give some cutout to that shape. So that was a really nice idea as well for Christmas ornaments. So next up, I want to take a look at, let's take a look at this one here. So we're going to take a look at some of the basics of 3D modeling within VCarve, or working with 3D models. VCarve has a surprising amount of capabilities when it comes to working with 3D models. Clearly Aspire, obviously that's the apex of it all, and you can do everything in Aspire basically, but you can still do a lot in VCarve. And there's actually some of what you can do in VCarve is quite advanced, and that's probably why it escapes people or they don't get into it, because as you'll see tonight, I'm going to try and keep this as straightforward as possible, but I got to tell you, this is kind of like juggling with a dozen balls at the same time when you're working in VCarve with 3D modeling. Much like other approaches inside of VCarve, there's multiple ways to do it. And so we'll look at some of those variations tonight. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is right here at the bottom, you probably recognize this toy. It's made up of little pins or nails. You put your hand on the bottom and raise it up. Well, within VCarve, 3D models like the one you see at the top, they are, in the VCarve world, they are modeled differently than vector lines. We've looked at a good number of vector lines. If I draw a star over there, and vector lines, if I look node edit, vectors are made up of these what are called nodes connected with these infinite lines in between that no matter how much you stretch them, you can scale them up and down, but they never lose their resolution. They always are the same size, the same fineness. And when you go to toolpath it, whether it's big or small, it'll cut on the line or in or outside the line exactly like you want it. Very precise. It's not true of 3D models. 3D models inside VCarve and Aspire, you can think of them a little like this pin model here. It's very similar to that, but you can also think of it a little bit more like sculpting with clay. So if you were thinking of making, let's say, an engine part or a mechanical part, you would have a very difficult time putting a hole in that part and having it machined precisely, because it's a little bit more like carving a hole in a piece of clay. With that said, because we're talking 3D modeling here and 3D shapes and 3D carving, that variation actually can be very forgiving. So you could create some really wonderful 3D shapes like you see up here above. So the reason this hand here and this pin game is comparable is that if you understand the world, like we talked about vectors and nodes, and then you've got the world of photography or JPEGs or bitmaps, which are made up of pixels. And so if you think of each of these nails as a single pixel, when you tell VCarve or Aspire to create a model, it takes some of those pixels and it raises them up, just like you see here. And as a result, it can get pretty fuzzy around the edge, especially straight vertical edges. That's the worst area for on the 3D models. There's ways to deal with it with all these, and usually making it acceptable. But just keep in mind tonight that as we start creating and working with some of these 3D models, it's all based on the fact that it works like this little game right here. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a couple of basic things looking here at, we're going to recreate this eagle head right here. And on the left side over here, we've got a clip art tab. And inside clip art, you'll have this clip art file. You may have some other files in there also. You could also access your local files. But this clip art file is what's given to you by VCarve. Now, if you don't have these, let me see if I can find an example. Probably can't here, but if you look at yours and you don't see anything here, then you need to go on your user account and download them off of Vectric. And then when you open them up, they will load up. At least images will. You may have some that have a download arrow, which means they're just up in the cloud and you have to download them. But Vectric provides a lot of free art like this, clip art. Now, this is 3D clip art. And so let's start out with this eagle head right here. To get that in here, you can left click and drag it, or you could just simply double click it and it'll place it right inside your drawing area. Now let's go ahead and split this view up. And there you can see the eagle head. Now, you've got a 2D view and a 3D view, as is typical. When you select the eagle head on either side, notice how it turns red, and that's because it's selected, just like, and if I click again, it highlights the handles and I can drag it out like that if I want, move it around. So you can manipulate it much like you do a regular vector. If we look at the 3D view and I rotate it, you can see how it's sitting on top of this pale surface. This pale surface right here is called the modeling plane. You can think of it like a tabletop. It has no volume. It has no mass. It's just a transparent working surface. And whenever you add a 3D model, that 3D model is added either to the top of that plane or it may be added below it if you are doing what's called a subtraction. It'll actually cut down into it. And we'll look at that tonight as well. But it's important to understand that this green box, I've got that highlighted up at the top here, that's actually our material square. And it's like, well, you know what? It's sitting on top of the material. And so as you're working with this, there's a couple of places where I recommend people kind of click into it out of so often. You want to save your file, obviously, on a regular basis. What happens sometimes, you're working with 3D models, that sometimes the image or the model seems to get locked up and you're not able to edit it or move it like you want it to. And it seems like doing a save as or a save will sometimes kind of force it to kind of sort itself out and get back in rhythm, get back in sync with your file. So that's just a little tip that sometimes I find I use. The other thing is that obviously, when I go to carve this, I want that model to be in my material, not sitting right on top like that in most cases. And the way you make that adjustment is if I go inside my right side over here, underneath material setup, very similar to your job setup, but notice when I open that, how that automatically dropped down. So now the modeling plane is partway down in there. And if you look at the right side over, it's this middle part right here that's most important. It actually gives you your model thickness, which right now this model is 0.47 thick, so a little under ½ inch. And it's represented by that light color right there. So if I move this bar up and down, I can actually position my model in my work. So now I just push my model all the way to the bottom of my material. So if I want it to be carved at the bottom of my material, I would want to make sure and push it to the bottom, or I can push it all the way to the top. You'll notice it's inside the material by default now. So that's, again, one of those things. By opening this box, it automatically synchronized it. So we'll close out of this. Actually, I'm going to leave that one open for now. Let's put these windows up again. Now, some of the ways that you can manipulate this in some of the basic ways inside of VCarve, I showed you how you can highlight it here, either in the 3D view or the 2D view. You could drag it. You could, these three boxes here, that shows the thickness. So I could actually click on that box. If I want to change that thickness to exactly a ½ inch, I could change that thickness to a ½ inch. And notice over here, the right side, it now says it's a ½ inch. So that works. Or you can also edit it inside what's called the component window. You'll spend a lot of time in the component window, so it's important to get familiar with it. You see it listed down here at the bottom. Let's see if I can get that. There we go. Okay, there it is. So when I double click on it, opens up the edit window for that what's called component or that 3D model. And there's the shape height. I can also change the height in here if I wanted to go 0.75. And you'll notice how it changes all the way across. One of the other main settings that we have within this component window, as far as size goes, is we have something called a base height. And you can think of a base height like the foundation on a house. So if I add a 1/4 inch base height, notice on the right side now how I have this straight edge right here. That's the base height. The model height still remains what I have up here at 3/4 inch. And of course, if I wanted to play around, I could flip that a little bit. I can make my model shallow and make my base heights tall. I lose a little bit of detail, but maybe I want a real shallow carving instead of a deep carving. So that's one option that you have for managing the thickness and the size. And just remember, the base height and the shape are two different things. And they're all, in this case, they're always measured from this modeling plane up. So I'm going to change that back to the 0.5 we were at for our basic shape height. And then if I go into, if I want to do some precision sizing on the X and Y direction, I could go to my main design window and open up the set object size. And this shows me my object. Now, when you're dealing with 3D models, you have this option down here to auto scale. So if you want to proportionally scale the thickness with the XY dimension, you could leave that checked. So I'm going to check that, and we'll take this up to 10 inches in both directions. Click apply. And notice how our thickness now has changed to 0.61. So it automatically scaled that up. However, let's take that back to where it was at about 8 inches. If we don't want to change the Z thickness, which is sometimes you just want to do the XY, then uncheck that. And now we can take that back up in both directions, and it won't change the thickness. So you can see here this, I've got 4 windows open right now. I've got my job set size. I've got my material set up. You don't always have to have this open on the right side. In fact, there's sometimes that it'll actually ask you to close it, but I just have it open right now for demonstration purposes. The other one you're going to spend a lot of time in, let's close out of this one, is this component window. Now, be aware as you're clicking around between these different windows, if I open up this window here, and I've got that edit window open, and then I go into my design window and I try to do something, it may or may not let me do it. There are some times when if you have too many windows open, your drawing will lock up and you got to go back and figure out which window is open and close it out so that you can continue. So just be aware that usually when you finish with one of these windows, it's best to close out of it before you go on to your next phase. And with that in mind, I'm going to close out of this one. I'm going to take that eagle head and just manually shrink that down to about right there. And I'm going to add another piece of design in here. Let's go to the clip art. Let's find a decorative. Let's see what I'm looking for, I think, is in this list. There it is. Okay. Now, notice how we can see it here in the 2D view. The 3D view, it's laying behind there. So I could select the 2D view, click once, click twice, and drag it down. And then I'm just going to stretch it up here a little bit, drag it back over. Something like that. And then I could also intersect it just a little bit there. Now notice how in the 3D view here, how those are just what is called merging together. This is something we're going to look at in the next exercise in more detail. But inside the component window, we have 2. We have the swag and we've got the eagle's head. You see these little symbols right here, and you see it says combine mode merge. Both of these are set at combine mode merge. If I right click on this, I get a selection here, and these are your basic combine modes. And the default one here is set up at merge. And merge is what you're seeing happening here, where they're basically just blending together. Now, if I were to take that eagle head and so I'm going to move the eagle head using these arrows, move it up above. Because the other thing you have to think about is that when you start stacking or combining 3D models, think of it as a layer cake, and the layer up, the next layer up interacts with the layers below it based on that symbol. So that eagle head right now is set at merge, but notice what happened when I change it to add. Add is like laying it on top of everything. And notice now how parts of those, it just lays right up on top, the same thickness. You can think of it like a blanket, just laying up on top of everything. And that's what the add mode does, because the eagle is set to the add mode and it's adding to the swag. Now, this bottom one, generally out of default, I usually leave that as add, although leaving it at merge isn't a problem. It's not acting with anything below it. So typically add or merge, it doesn't have any effect. Now, if we were to, actually, I'm going to put it back to merge. The reason the order matters over the left side over here is if I have that eagle at add and I move that to the bottom of my layer cake and my stack over here, notice what happens. It's no longer laying on top of the swag. And the reason for that is because the swag is set to merge with the eagle. So see, the swag is taking priority here. So that's the one that's going to be, whatever this one is set at is what it's going to do to the one below it. So then those swag. So not only do you have to think about combine mode, but you also have to think about the order that they're stacked in. So the next thing we'll do is let's take a look at a little bit of tool pathing on this. Let me think. Actually, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to take and add this circle to the outside. Let's put a circle around this. Shrink everything down just a little bit so it fits better. There we go. Okay. Now, a couple of quick things on tool pathing. Over the right side here, there are two specific tool paths made for 3D modeling. One is the 3D roughing, and it does what it says. It roughs it out. I'm not going to go into all the details and all these settings tonight, but it's pretty typical to use something like a 1/4 inch end mill bit for small carvings like this. And the settings here that I want to look at, the one is called the model boundary. Now, in this drawing, the only thing that's a model is the eagle and the swag. Okay, so those are the only two things that are recognized as models. This background is not a model. That's just a modeling plane. So it will only look at those two objects. And let's go ahead and 3D rough that. And we can preview it. And there you can see how it 3D roughed it out. Now, it's going all the way to the bottom, and you're like, wait a minute, I really want that up higher. So this is a time where you can go into your material setup, and let's move that to the top rather than the bottom. Say okay. It'll ask you to recalculate. Say yes to that. And now we can go back and preview it again. And that's closer to the surface. Now notice how you've got a couple islands right here. And even this little piece over here. Some of that may chip off during machining, and it may or may not be an issue, but you're going to see when we get to 3D finishing, it becomes a little bit more of a problem. And that's because that's that gap inside that opening there. So 3D finishing, the 3D roughing sets up, if we look at the side here, you can see it setting up with multiple pass steps going down. So whatever your pass step, 1/8 of an inch, 1/10 of an inch, 0.05, whatever it is, that's what it's going to cut in those pass steps. And then it leaves a small blanket of material roughed out on top, a small thickness of material roughed out on top. And then for that, we use the 3D finishing then to remove the rest of that. In this case, I'm going to use a single 1/8 inch bit. Again, use the model boundary and calculate that. And let's preview that. And there you can see that it's done a reasonable job of carving that. Now, obviously, unless you're going to go back and you could cut this, we could put a tool path all the way around this. You could cut this out like like with a bandsaw, but actually do it your CNC if you want to use it as an applique. That is something you could do as well. But also notice now we've got this issue with this little island right here, and we got some roughness going around. So for this one, from a design standpoint, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to go back inside my 3D roughing, and I'm going to select that circle, and I'm going to use selected vectors. And from a design standpoint, I want to have that background cut out so it mimics what you see up there. So that will give me that setup. You can see now how it's machining all the way around the outside. I'm going to do the same thing with the 3D finishing. Go back and do vector boundary. And if we take a close look at the 3D finishing, you can see here how we only have a single pass. That's because it's just taking off that thin layer that's left by the 3D roughing. Let me just open up the 3D roughing. If you're not familiar with this setting, it's right here. It's called machining allowance. And somewhere between 0.02 and 0.04 is pretty common. I find that 0.02 and most of the work I do works out just fine. So I don't usually leave much allowance at all because it always leaves a little bit of a rough surface. So that's the minimum amount that it's leaving. That's the low points. The thicker points could be 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch thick. So there still could be a lot of material to take off. So that usually works out well. Okay, so let's go to the preview now. And we'll 3D the roughing first. And then the 3D finishing is going to go in. Before we do that, notice how the 3D roughing now took out that area in the middle right here, because it took out this whole background as well as that. And now if I do the 3D finishing, it does a nice job of leaving that. So now I have a pretty good plaque. Now, there's one other thing you'll notice when you use this approach for doing a recessed plaque like this, and this will come into play with some other 3D modeling, 3D machining that you do. So I want to mention this. Notice here along the edge how we've got a rough edge, and then there's a little bit of a cleanup right here. The reason you have this 2 steps here is two reasons, or yeah. One is we're using a 1/4 inch router bit for the first cut and an 1/8 inch ball nose for the second cut. So the 1/4 inch is cutting a little further in. What's important to understand that when you use a vector outline like this, that these 2 little circles here represent a 1/4 and a 1/4 and a 1/8 inch router bit. The roughing bit, when you use a vector line, the roughing bit, the center of that bit goes to the line. And the same thing with the finishing. The finishing goes right to that line. So it basically goes on the line. So if you had a very precise circle that you were trying to cut, you actually have to make that circle smaller by at least the radius of your largest bit, because it's going to cut to that direction. So that's what's happening in these 2 setups here. That's why you have this rough edge, and then the 1/8 inches coming in and just coming up to it. Now, in 3D carving, this is actually a nice arrangement. Setting aside the fact that you may not like this rough edge, and I'll show you a way to deal with that. But it's nice to have the 1/4 inch bit cut a little larger than the 1/8 inch bit. That way, because remember, the 1/8 inch bit is going along the surface here. And if it were to hit against that wall, it's that full 1/2 inch. It's like slamming up against a brick wall with that little tiny bit. And you're going to get a lot of chatter and potentially break the bit. And so it's actually nice to have that extra clearance around there for that 1/8 inch bit, so that it has an advantage that way. But from a design standpoint, it doesn't, first of all, the roughing bit doesn't leave a very nice finish to it. A way to clean that up is to make use of the vector, to simply go in and add a profile toolpath. In this case, let's double check something here. See how thick our model was. Okay, 4949. So I should have rounded that off, but I didn't. We could live with that. So I'm going to open up my profile toolpath. I'm using a 1/4 inch router bit, and I'm going to cut 4949, exactly the same depth as the finished tool or the model. And I'm just going to cut right on the line. Well, actually, no, I need to cut outside the line, because if I cut on the line, I'm just going to match the roughing bit. And if I cut outside, I'll take an extra 1/8 of an inch. Now, there are 3 other ways to do this, and I'll touch on those, but I just wanted to give you the basic overview with this understanding of how these basically function. So let's set that depth. I'm going to go to the outside. And if I preview that over here, you can see there how that path is going to clean that up. And if we actually preview it in our actual 3D model, it cleaned it up nicely all the way around. So that gives you a nice finished inside edge. Now, without, at risk of getting a little bit in the weeds here, you have what's called allowance offset. And if I go inside the 3D roughing, you also have, let's see, where is it here? Oh, this was not, yes, boundary offset. You see that boundary offset? What that will do is if you put a positive or negative number in that, that will push this router bit in or out by however much you put in that boundary offset. So you can control that clearance along there. So if I wanted this to be an additional 1/8 of an inch, I could do something like that. Oops, didn't select the correct vector. Let's get that one right there. Reset that. And now you can see how that 1/4" bit is cutting a good bit beyond that edge. So let's just preview that. And, oh, that was the 3D finishing. Let's do the 3D roughing. And then the 3D finishing. So that's what an offset, boundary offset does. And the 3D finishing also has a boundary offset. And you also have inside the profile toolpath something called an allowance offset. These all these do the same thing. They move that router bit's position relative to the vector line. They move it in or they move it out. So by default, I didn't use any of those to start with, and I got good results. And that's where I recommend people just start out. But there are times that you may want to tweak your offsets for particular reasons and for sizing or cleanup and such. So those tools are available to you as well. This background, which is called the modeling plane, you can toggle that on and off up here like that. You can see it disappears. I can turn off the material. I can turn off the vectors. I can turn on my datum location. So let's turn on the material. So there you can see my datum is at the top of my material. It's in the middle of my material. So you've got all these toggles up here you can deal with. Sometimes the modeling plane kind of gets in the way visually, so it's nice just to turn it off. Other times it's quite helpful. Now I mentioned how everything at this point, we've either added or merged these models, and let's go over this way with it. If we go inside components, and I were to open up this eagle head, and change that to exactly a 1/2 inch. And I put that on rather than add. If I put it on merge, it has no effect. Again, it's on the bottom. It doesn't really have any effect at that point. It's just staying the same. But this one, which is referred to as subtract, actually has a major impact. Notice there, it now actually makes it a negative, and it actually now is going below the modeling plane by that amount. And we're going to be using that feature in the next demo, but that's what subtract does, is it actually does the inverse and goes down. Now for this particular one, let's do the swag. If I were actually to do a subtract on that, they end up both going down. And if we look at the, if we were to toolpath these, you would end up with a recess, something like a mold. And that's actually one way that this can be used. But there's another option we have that we'll look at, like I said, the next demo. But that's what the subtract does. Generally, I'm going to leave these both at merge or add. Back to that design. There is another feature in here, which is quite this whole list of 3D modeling tools. A couple of them that point out here. One is that if you wanted to draw a vector around this whole area, this first one right here will create a vector boundary around the selected components. So selected means they have to be highlighted. So we would go in here, highlight one, highlight the second one, and they're both red, which means they're both selected, or I could select them in this window. You also could select them in the 2D window so they turn dark. But then in the design window, we select this create vector boundary. And if we zoom in on this, we now have a boundary line all the way around that. So you could use that for cutout or for other purposes. While we're looking at that, it's worth zooming in here. Remember I mentioned how you have a ragged edge, and that's pretty typical. Now, typically when you go to machine this with 3D carving, unless this is a tall vertical base edge, it usually turns out fairly smooth, but you just do have to realize that around the edges, you'll typically have more texture potentially. And then one other one in this window is the second one is called a cross section, which is really interesting. So if I take that and I click there and over there, it creates a vector which represents the cross section of my shape. And next week, when we get into the dish design for the next project, I'll be making a lot of use of this. And you'll see how it's actually really helpful. One other one in here that I like to use a lot is this one right over here, and it's called Add a Plane Component. Now notice when I click on this, let's first of all, I'm going to turn the visibility of those two off so there's no model over here. And I add a plane. Notice on the right side here how I still have this thin piece of veneer. It has gotten darker in color, however, but it looks just like my modeling plane in the same location. In fact, if I turn on the components, it pretty much looks the same. However, a zero plane, which is highlighted right now, think of it as, it starts out like a thin piece of veneer with really zero thickness. In fact, if I open up this component, notice how it has zero base height. There's zero thickness to that. The way I use this is I'll often change the name to project, like this, project material. And I'll give it a thickness of my project, which in this case would be 1 inch. And I've actually created a block. Now I want that block to be on the bottom, so let's move it to the bottom. Now again, we need to kind of resync this. So let's close out of this a minute, open this up, and look what it's telling us. We have an error, and that's because our block that we created plus our model is 1.5 inches thick. So it's too thick for our overall material, our actual material. So at this point, we have to go back and edit this, or you have to get a thicker piece of material. I'm going to go back in and edit this, and I'm going to change this project material to 1/2 inch thick. And now everything on the right side works out. Now what I have going on over here is this whole area is a model. Go back into the 3D roughing, and you'll notice that now if I were to do model boundary, it would be the same as material boundary because that whole area is being carved. You're going to see how in the next demo, how having this material, project material is useful. It kind of provides you a realistic working surface. It gives you a little bit more visual control. It gives you a little bit more control as far as where things are going, because without that, this is kind of floating right there. I can make the adjustment up here, and that works fine. But if I add that project block, it gives me some realistic appearance. Now notice how the swag has disappeared. And that's because the swag is set to merge. So I need to set that swag to add to get that back on top. Okay, so now this creates another challenge. So I've got everything on top of my block of wood, but I've got that little oddness going on between the eagle and the ribbon right there. So how do I fix that? Well, I put the swag on add. If I want that swag to merge with the eagle, based on what I said earlier, I should put it on merge. But then what happens is it merges with the project board and disappears. So what I need to do, in fact, let me take that project board for a minute and slide that over. You can see what's happening here. See, the eagle's on add, so the eagle adds to the model plate at the bottom, and then it adds to that board, but the ribbon just merges right into it, disappears. Take that and recenter that. To fix that ribbon, what I'm going to do is open it up. I'm going to leave it on merge because I want it to blend with the eagle, but I'm going to open it up. And this is where I would add a base height to bring it up above that surface. So let's add the 1/2 inch base height, and bingo, it pops up. It's merging nicely with the eagle feathers right there. And this looks good at this point. So this would be a good example also where you could machine this entire surface and then go back in and engrave some text on that if you wanted to do that as well. Okay, let's hop over to the next demo. This is one of my favorite ones. I bring this up here. This makes use of 3 different shapes that are inside that come with VCarve, 3 different models, but we're going to use it based on some of what we already did, some of the way we use those other components. Okay, so I'm going to go inside, and the first thing I'm going to set up is I'm going to go ahead and add my 0 plate. So I'm going to add a 0 plate. You can see how it is now visible on the right side. It's down there at the bottom. I'm going to go to my component tab, open up the 0 plane, rename that project material, and then give it a base height of 1 inch. And now I've created my block of wood. So I like that, so I'm going to close out of that. Next, I need to gather my other models. Now I have 3 models here. I have this dish shape, I have this bottle cap, and this mug. Let's go inside clip art, look for those. Let's see, I think they're inside. Here we go. So let's go ahead and double click that, and I can drag this off to the side to get the bottle cap off to the side, and we'll also add a dish or dome shape. So let's add this one. Okay, so I've got my objects gathered together here. Let's go back in a component window. We can see all of them here. I'm going to reorder them. I want the dish to be down here right above the project material and the bottle cap next. Again, I'm stacking this based on how my design is stacking up here. Turn off the project material for a minute, and there you can see the dome. Now notice how the mug and the cap are not showing. The only thing that shows, and the only thing that VCarve recognizes for tool pathing or for modeling are objects that are above the white area here, that material project area. So if I want to work on the mug, I have to drag it back in. You can see here how it only shows up halfway over here. So that's, move them to the side. They are hidden in the 3D view. So let's start with the dome. And let's think about the dome for a minute. We're going to open it up. Rather than a dome, we want that to be a dish. So let's do a subtract on that. And there we can see we've got a nice dish now at the top of our material because it starts at the surface of the object that's over here, of that component, and it subtracts from that because it's set on subtract. Now, shape height in the upper right up here, we're going to set that, our project board is an inch thick. So let's make this 3/4 of an inch. And there we've got a nice deep dish. Next, we need to scale it up. So we'll close out of that window, go to our design window and open up our set object size window. And this is where we want to make sure and uncheck the auto Z because we've already set the thickness. We don't want that to change. We just want the XY. So let's go in and make that. See how this looks. Apply. And let's take that down just a little bit. There we go. So now we've got a nice little dish shape cutting out of that. So now let's take and move the bottle cap, center that. And again, notice how the bottle cap is just peeking up through the surface. So let's look at the bottle cap, open it up. Let's set that to add for a minute. And that looks pretty good, but if we were to look close at this, we would notice that the surface of the bottle cap is concave. The reason it's concave is that it's telegraphing the concave shape of this dome inside or this dish. For some designs that might be okay, but for this one, I want that to be perfectly flat. So I need to have that as a merge, but it's sinking too deep down. So I need to bring it up. So we'll use that same trick we did earlier, is we will add a base height of, let's put a base height of 1/4 inch, since that's how thick the bottom of our dome is. And there we can see how the cap is now brought up. And again, if we were to look at that, in fact, if we were to do a cross section, let's do that right now. You can see there how the bottle cap has a nice level top to it right there in the cross section versus the concave that we had earlier. Now I want to do a little bit of planning here, and that is that I want this bottle cap to be bigger in diameter. I also want the bottle cap to be just a little under the surface of my material. I'm going to put the mug on top, and the mug's going to be 1/4 inch thick. So the total height of my bottle cap has to allow for that. So that means the top of it has to be 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of my material. So I'll go back into my components and double check some things. So let's make the shape height 1/4 inch. And let's see, when I do that, it drops it back down. Let's make the base height 0.5. And there, look at that. It brings it up nice and sharp. We've got a little bit of a straight edge around it, which is nice. It'll be nice and proud. Got a good looking bottle cap right there. And the total height of that bottle cap is 3/4 of an inch. Now let me point something out. While I'm holding my cursor over the top of this bottle cap, if you look down in the lower right side down here, right now it says Z0. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. If you can't, when you have a chance to look at your own screen, check it out. Because when I put my cursor over the bottle cap, that changes to a negative 0.25. And that's giving me the dimension of how far my bottle cap is from the top of my material. So that's pretty handy to do a quick check to see what the height of that is. Go back into that bottle cap now and let's change the size and increase that to, let's say, 7 inches. There we go. Now, since I had the auto Z unchecked, the height has maintained itself and it's just enlarged in diameter. Now I can bring the mug and center that over the center. Again, it's disappearing. So let's look at the combine mode. It's set on merge. In this case, I want the mug to go directly on top of the cap. So I could change that combine mode to add. And I think I'll scale that down a little bit. Let's make the height, see how it looks at 3 inches. Maybe 3.5. There we go. Now, one other thing, now that I have these pretty well all established, this mug, we know it should be about a 1/4 inch thick. And I'm sure that if I go in here, let's take a look and see what it is. So it's a little over a 1/4 inch. Now, I would want to change that, but when you're doing modeling, if for some reason you miss one of these settings, it's always very important before you finalize your tool paths. In fact, before you set those up and calculate those, go up into your material setup and check this setting. Now, this again is showing me that I have an error. So I need to go in and I'm going to change that. And everything's looking good on that side. Let's close out of that. Say okay on that. And then for the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit about adding some text to this curve. Go in here and let's just insert some text. Like that. Now this is a situation where I might want to also then add this circle around here for a couple of reasons. One is I could go like that and I could use this tool and it creates a circle around it. I can now use that circle as my curve to curve my text. And it curved it, but it put it on the wrong side. Now, the reason for that is because of where the start point on the circle is set up. But an easy fix for that is to grab that green dot right there and just slide it around to the bottom like that and reposition it. Now let's look at our setup. Let's do an offset maybe of about a 1/2 inch. See if that'll offset for the edge. That looks good. And then I also, my text spacing, let's increase that. So that does that does them all at the same time. You could also go back in to your text tool and notice here how I could go make it closer, hold the shift key down, I can make it further apart. Now, because I'm on the curve, it's doing some strange stuff, so you got to watch for that. Let's move that apart a little bit. A little closer together. There we go. That looks good. We'll keep that. Now notice how in this 2D window, we've lost our bottle cap and our beer mug. So the reason for that is that kind of like layers, these models stack up a little different. And sometimes they're visible and sometimes they're not. To correct this, it's fairly easy. You go into the component window. Let's take the bottle cap. It's visible there, but as soon as I off click, it disappears. If you right click on that bottle cap component, you get a 2D preview and it says move to front. And now it's visible in the 2D view no matter what I do. And then the beer mug is the last one I want. So I'm going to take and bring that to the front. And now everything is nicely visible in the 2D view. So if they go hiding on you, that's one way to fix it. Now I've got my text, I've got my model set up. Let's take and now do the 3D roughing. Now on the 3D roughing, because this whole area, if I do a model boundary, it's going to do the entire area. And I really don't need the whole area done because this flat area is part of my major board. So even though that's a model, I'm going to use the selected vector. And I'm going to use that vector I created. And I'm going to calculate that portion of it. And then I'll do the same thing with the finishing window. Select that vector. And let's preview those two before we use the VCarve. Use the roughing. And then the finishing. And then the VCarve, I'll select my text. Now, it's one of the special settings within VCarve is if you look down here at the bottom, it says project toolpath on the 3D model. And that actually will look for this 3D model surface. It'll actually project that VCarving onto that surface. So I can do that. And if we look at this, you can actually see how it's curved going down on that surface right there. If I did not have that checked, you can see how it's sitting up on top because it thinks it's carving on the top of the material. If I were to preview that, it's not touching it. So I'll go back in, open it up, project it onto the 3D model, and now it'll carve it right down into it. Now, having done that, everything looks pretty good. And I've got this all set up, and I'm like, you know what? I need to carve this in thinner material. But I don't want to have to go back through all those settings. I just want to modify this. Well, here's a couple quick ways to modify it. One is you've got a tool over here. It says scale height, Z height of all visible components. So if I open that up, it shows me my current height, and you could do a percentage. Or you could do a set exact height. So if I wanted to change it to a new height of, say, 0.75, I could change it. That's one way to do that. The other option is on the right side up here. You also have a set button, which brings up that same window. So as I mentioned before, there's sometimes 2 and 3 ways to do things in VCarve, and they all basically get the same job done. In this case, it just happens to be the same tool. You're just accessing it from 2 different ways. So in this case, I could actually, let's close out of this a minute, cancel out of that. I'm going to use this one on the right side, and I'm going to change that to 0.75. And close out of that. So now my whole model has been scaled to that new dimension. And I could actually change the thickness of my material too if I wanted to. And now I'm actually end up using 3/4 inch material. And my model is 3/4 of an inch. It's all scaled down in the Z height. The X and Y hasn't changed, just the Z height. And when I click OK on here, it's probably going to ask me, yep, to recalculate all the tool paths, and it'll go back and recalculate those. Now, something that's true of 3D model tool paths, as with everything else, is that if you go back inside any of your designs and you make a change, if I took that beer mug and I moved it there a little bit, and that's where I wanted it, I need to recalculate my tool paths because it does not know that. It's not going to automatically do that for you. So it's really important before you export your tool path. What I like to do is use this green button up here, depending on how I have my tool path set up, but I'll just hit recalculate and it'll recalculate everything, and I don't have to do them individually. In fact, if you have a two-sided one set up, it'll recalculate all of them, both sides. And so then now that once they're recalculated with that new design layout, let's see here. There we go. Okay, so now it's telling me one or more errors occurred while recalculating. Please check the following toolpaths carefully. So something happened with those setups in the calculation. So when that occurs, then it's important to go back in, and since none of these are checked, maybe the roughing was okay. I will typically just try and hit recalculate again and let it run through it again and see what happens. The point I'm trying to make here is to make sure and get a set of clean tool paths that have recalculated correctly. And after they're recalculated, go back and do a preview of your 3D toolpathing to make sure that they look the way you want them to. I've worked with, okay, so we're still getting that same error. So what I'm going to do is open up this 3D finishing, and it's asking for a vector. And I'm not sure why it didn't recognize that vector, but I'm going to try and calculate it directly. And that looks like that was successful. I'm now going to go into my VCarving and do the same thing. And that looks successful too. And just to make sure, I'm going to go back into my roughing and rerun that one as well. There we go. Now we can reset that and preview all of those. Okay, so I offset the beer mug, so now you see that it's offset. Now, a couple of things that are worth pointing out with these 3D tool paths is that in this roughing one, right now, reset that, I have that set up going at a 45-degree angle. I will typically run my 3D roughing either at a 45-degree angle, or I'll run it perpendicular to the grain direction. The reason I like to do that is that running a perpendicular or 45, it tends to cut across the fibers, and that way you don't get a lot of long chipping going on. It tends to cut those off better, and it doesn't, it just, I find it works better overall in most woods to do it that way. You get a cleaner roughing cut set up. Now the 3D finishing, on the other hand, if we run that one, notice how that's running with the grain. I would say 99% of the time when I run my 3D finishing, I'm running with the grain, because any tool marks that are left are minimized because they're going with the grain. If they're going across the grain, you're going to get machine marks that are more visible, and they're much harder to sand out. The other thing that's worth pointing out in this is notice how this 3D finishing one is starting up here in the shallow. Think of this like a lake, and it's going down to the deep area, and it's working its way across. In a design like this, you could actually, many times, you could actually skip the 3D roughing. You don't actually need to do the 3D roughing because in a design like this, notice how the router bit is going in one spot in a shallow area. Oh, here, let me reset this. Do this. So there's the 3D finishing, and it's going deeper and deeper and deeper because when it starts its cutting, it's basically cutting zero material at a very shallow depth. And then the step over is such a tiny amount that it puts very little load on the router bit. So even though this is an 1/8 inch diameter router bit, I have done carvings that are 3/4 of an inch deep with a 1/8 inch router bit that can cut that deep. I've got a couple that have probably a 1 inch to 1 1/8 inch cutting height on them. And I saved the time of doing the 3D roughing. Okay, with that, let's take a look at importing. So importing is one of those areas where you start out with a design you're going to bring in from some other source. It could be something you downloaded from Vectric. It could be something you download off the internet. It could be something somebody made for you out of Aspire or some other 3D modeling program. There's a couple of things that can go wrong during this import. It's kind of hard to duplicate some of these things, but I'll kind of show you and walk you through. So show you the settings to watch for so you can avoid it. It depends a little bit on how that original design was set up. Sometimes designs are set up really big or really small, or they're set up off-centered. This one is set up in a pretty normal way, so it should import okay. But to import a 3D model in VCarve, use this 3D model component import button at the top up here. Going to rotate. Most often from Vectric, they have a proprietary model style. One that you'll typically get off the internet will be an STL or an OJ, OBJ perhaps. Those are two of the most common. Sometimes a DXF, 3D DXF, but STL is really common. So I'll open that one up. And that opens up an import window. And in this import window, you've got various settings up here depending on how you're viewing it. Now, we're looking at this right here. And if we rotate this, we can see how it's positioned. And the red line around the outside, that's our material block. Sometimes you import these designs that they're much bigger than your block. And so you have to go in here and size it. And the one that I usually work with right here is that if I want to have my model at a certain thickness, like let's say I wanted this to be 3/4 of an inch thick, I would set my Z height, lock my XYZ, apply, and then that would scale my model before I imported it to the correct thickness. The other thing I usually do is I click on center, and that just centers the model perfectly in my material. Sometimes it's off center, sometimes it's way above or below the material, so that just brings it nicely into the middle of the material. Those are some of the major settings you would do in this, you would add to this window. Now, these windows up here give you some other ways to play and manipulate it with it. This one just gives you, these give you basically like the side view, the front view, depending on the orientation you want. Those are not too hard to use. If you get into these rotational ones, you have to be careful because you're actually rotating it in 3D space, and you can screw up your import pretty quickly playing around with those if you don't understand how to use them. The good news is if you do screw it up, just delete it, back out of it, and re-import it again. You'll get a fresh opportunity from a fresh start. Okay, at this point, I'll click Position and Import. And notice we have a material plane. We have a top and bottom side. You have some options here for a basic one-sided import. Usually the best thing to do is move this slider down to the bottom, which puts your project on top of the material plane or the modeling plane. You don't need to worry about its position inside your project. That will self-correct itself once you import it. If there was some reason that you were trying to remove part of the back, you could clip off part of the thickness like that. Like in this case, if I wanted that, I don't know, let's see what happens if I put it at a 1/2 inch. Okay, now the problem with that is this light gray area. I'm trying to cut away from that. So I don't like that. I could go 6, and now I've got all the way that. And in this case, if I wanted to delete the material below the 0 plane, that's what I would do. But in this case, I'm going to move it back to the bottom, like I said, and import the whole model. But the setup in this window is going to have a lot to play on how it ends up revealing itself inside your VCarve window. If you get some of these settings a little off, you'll end up with weird things, like you may end up with your design cut halfway through. You may not be able to work on the other side of it. Strange things happen. So give it a try. You can certainly, like I said, if you screw it up, you can just go back and redo it again. It's not too hard to figure out what these are with a little bit of practice. So I import that, and there's my model. Now, again, it's sitting on the top up there, so I correct that. I'll just kind of synchronize everything, and let's open up my job set or my material setup, and that'll pop it back down to where I want it. Now, in this case, I'm going to leave it right there, and I'm not going to change those for now. And I have my 3D model all set up now in my 3D view. I can add my tool paths and whatever else I want to do with it. Well, the last thing I want to show you guys for tonight is, so coming up next week, we will be using VCarve to create this 2-sided candy dish with some 3D clip art on it. This is all created in VCarve. No Aspire whatsoever, and it uses all the models that are readily available inside VCarve, and it uses a couple extra techniques that I didn't go over tonight. So we'll be looking at that next week. That candy dish is for the January rather, project of the month. So those of you that are on the newsletter list, you'll be getting a notice of that. I'm actually going to include a copy of that for those of you that signed up for this webinar tonight. You'll actually get an early release of that. And so you'll have a chance to look at that this week, give me some feedback. And then next week, we'll actually go into the design process. And if we have time for the tool pathing, we'll take a look at that as well. So with that, that wraps it up for tonight. Well, thanks everybody for coming out another night, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Good night.
Good night now.